Welcome to the Shorten Anime channel. Today we'll dive into the latest episode of The Great Ruler. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to support the channel. The Great Ruler, Season 1, Episode 41. The much-anticipated entry competition closed the curtains with Mu Chen obtaining the most valuable seeded entry. However, everybody within the Northern Spiritual Square was still immersed in the fierce battle earlier. Many people were amazed by that fight. With his spiritual rotation stage late phase strength and the power of his spiritual pulse, Liu Mubai was almost regarded as having no opponents beneath the spirit stage. However, who would have expected that he would ultimately be defeated by Mu Chen, who was only a spiritual rotation stage initial phase? This result made everybody secretly sighed. No wonder Mu Chen was able to become the only one qualified for the spiritual road within the Northern Spiritual Realm. Although Lu Qingtian was extremely dissatisfied with the final judgment made by Mr. Hao, he was not stupid. The latter's background was extremely powerful, and he would not care about his identity of the Liu territory's territory lord. Since that he lost the seeded entry, he could only think of another approach. After resting for a while, Mu Chen and Liu Mubai gradually recovered a bit of strength. However, Liu Mubai had an extremely cold and ugly expression. Under numerous gazes, Mr. Hao looked across the stage and waved his hand. Then the 12 people that participated for the entry competition hurried onto the stage as they were stared enviously. The final results have come out for the entry competition today. Mr. Hao's eyes fixed themselves at Mu Chen and the others as he faintly said, "Originally, there should be only 6 entries, including the seeded entry. However, there is a slight change right now." Afterwards, Mr. Hao turned his gaze towards Mo Ling, who was sweating nervously, and said, "You have lost the competition originally. Based on the rules, you should be disqualified." Mo Ling's eyes turned dark and revealed a bitter expression. "However, your perseverance and courage is commendable. Your talent is also acceptance. Thus, I will make an exception and give you an entry this time," Mr. Hao said. Mo Ling was stunned. His face immediately turned red with excitement and hurriedly bowed down as he said, "Thank you, Mr." Mr. Hao nodded. Then he turned around to look at Tang Qianer and Hong Ling. "The two of you drew. Normally speaking, this should not have happened. However, I can look aside and hand both of you an entry." Tang Qianer and Hong Ling were instantly filled with joy when they heard this. "However, there is a condition," Mr. Hao said. "What's the condition?" Tang Qianer and Hong Ling quickly asked. "You can only choose to enter the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy 1, Mr. Hao said with a faint smile. The Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy? Tang Qianer and Hong Ling were stunned. The 5 Great Academies. Accurately speaking, it is the title for 5 spiritual academies. These 5 spiritual academies are known respectively as Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy, Azure Sky Spiritual Academy, Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy, Martial Spiritual Academy, and the Saint Spiritual Academy. Amongst them, the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy was rather unique as they only recruit female students. Naturally, you should not underestimate the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy due to this. To be able to become one of the 5 great academies with just females, the strength of the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy was absolutely terrifying, to the point where it was utterly indescribable. Moreover, the name of the 5 great academies actually had some sort of origin. It was said that each of the 5 great academies had an ancient divine beast living there that had once shocked the world. In fact, the name of the 5 great academies are actually derived from the name of the 5 ancient divine beasts. "So what's your decision?" Mr. Hao looked at Tang Qianer and Hong Ling. To be honest, there were indeed much less female students compared to male students during the recruitment process. As the recruiter for the 5 great academies, he would fail his job if he didn't find enough people for the Million Phoenix Academy. Although the people within the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy were all females, it was precisely because of this that it was extremely tough and troublesome. Hong Ling did not hesitate at all and directly nodded her head. To be able to enter the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy was just as she had wished. Although the other 4 spiritual academies were not terrible compared to the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy, the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy was still the one that suited her the most. Tang Qianer hesitated for a moment. She peeked and glanced at Mu Chen. If that's the case, wouldn't she be in a different spiritual academy than Mu Chen? However, if she did not accept, would she have another choice? As if he was aware of Tang Qianer's gaze, Mu Chen nodded at her. The Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy was actually quite suitable for Tang Qianer. It would be irrational if she failed to enter it. Seeing Mu Chen nod his head, Tang Qian'er bit her red lips and bitterness filled her eyes. Then she tilted her head and said to Mr. Hao, "I'll select the Million Phoenix Spiritual Academy as well." When that happened, Mr. Hao smiled. Afterwards, he turned to look at Liu Mubai and the others and asked, "Your decisions are?" "I'll choose the Azure Skies Spiritual Academy." Chen Fan and Huo Yun exchanged glances and actually selected the same spiritual academy. "I'll choose the Saint Spiritual Academy." Liu Mubai pondered for a moment and said without any hesitation, he had considered about it a long time ago. Although the strength of the 5 great academies was absolutely terrifying, he still discovered that the Saint Spiritual Academy was considered the leader amongst the 5 great academies if you really had to rank them. It was said that the Saint Spiritual Academy was always the strongest in the competitions shared between the 5 great academies during the past few years. Mr. Hao glanced at Liu Mubai and nodded without saying anything. Then he turned his attention towards Mu Chen and said, "What about you?" Everybody nearby immediately set their sights towards Mu Chen. As the one who obtained the seated entry, no matter which spiritual academy he entered, he should be able to obtain far more resources and status compared to an ordinary student. Liu Mubai stared hatefully at Mu Chen, and his eyes revealed that he was extremely unwilling. That was what he was supposed to enjoy. Mu Chen pouted his lips for a moment. A transparent, glass-like pair of beautiful eyes and silver long hair flashed through his mind. As he thought about this, he slowly clenched his hands. "Mr. Hao, may I ask you for some information?" Mu Chen took a deep breath and respectfully asked Mr. Hao. Mr. Hao smiled and nodded his head. He felt quite satisfied with Mu Chen. "I want to ask about 2 people." Mu Chen said in a soft voice, "Mr. Hao, you should have heard of the name Ji Xuan, right?" When Mu Chen said this name out, Mr. Hao's eyes narrowed. His face also became serious, and he stared deeply at Mu Chen as he spoke. Ji Xuan. In the Spiritual Roads trial, he was a person that was assessed as a king class. He was one of the most dazzling individuals within the Spiritual Road and obtained a core entry for the 5 great academies. Everybody's expression changed when they heard these words. Although they were unfamiliar with that name, they could feel an intense pressure. A core entry. It was something that could only be obtained by a person who was like a monster. King class, huh? Mu Chen's eyes drooped slightly. This was the highest class of assessment within the Spiritual Road. However, it was within his expectations that Ji Xuan would obtain this assessment with his abilities. Which spiritual academy did he enter? Mu Chen's voice remained calm. Nobody could tell what sort of emotions were within his voice. Mr. Hao stared at Mu Chen. Shortly after, he said, Ji Xuan entered the Saint Spiritual Academy and was even specially named out by the higher-ups of the Saint Spiritual Academy. The Saint Spiritual Academy? Mu Chen glanced at Liu Mubai. Then he nodded his head slightly before he hesitated for a moment. His originally sharp and cold gaze suddenly turned gentle. The second person I would like to ask is called Luo Li. Mu Chen scratched his head and asked, Luo Li? Mr. Hao frowned and said faintly, Luo Li. She was also assessed as a king class within the Spiritual Roads trial. She also obtained a core entry for the 5 great academies. Everybody at the scene secretly clucked their tongues. What sort of insane individuals are within the Spiritual Road? She's also a king class. Mu Chen smiled. If it's her, she definitely had the ability. It seems that she became a lot more powerful after he had left the Spiritual Road. Then which spiritual academy did she enter? Mu Chen looked at Mr. Hao nervously. He had made a promise with her. If it deviated from it, she would probably put on a terrible face when they met again with her personality, though she would always have an indifferent expression. Luo Li entered the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. Mr. Hao stared at Mu Chen with a smile that didn't seem like a smile. Then he said, originally, the Martial Spiritual Academy's Lord Principal had personally spoken with her and wanted to let her enter the Martial Spiritual Academy. But in the end, she rejected and instead chose the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. At the side, Chen Fan and the others were completely flabbergasted. Isn't that simply too arrogant? Hearing this, Mu Chen was also stunned. He had an exceptionally complex expression on his face. The Spiritual Road. As the cold night enveloped the lands, a warm bonfire rose up within the depths of a forest. Beside the bonfire, a boy was fiddling with the fire and caused the warm flames to float toward the right. At that location, a girl with black clothes was sitting there quietly. Her delicate face was buried within her knees, and she only revealed a pair of glass-like eyes. She stared at the handsome face of the black-haired boy in front of her as she was warmed by the flames. Her eyes curved gently like a crescent moon. However, the curvature was minimal and was impossible to detect. You... She suddenly extended her slender white hands over and pulled out a wood unconsciously. She casually asked, "After the spiritual road is over, which spiritual academy would you enter?" "Me?" The boy thought for a moment. He smiled and said, "I'll probably go to the Northern Heavens Spiritual Academy. I was born in the Northern Spiritual Realm, so I have a good feeling with the word north." The girl glanced at him. Her voice was flat, like the sounds of the valley, and she said, "The Northern Heavens Spiritual Academy? I don't want to go there. It seems that we'll have to separate after the spiritual road is over." The boy was stunned. He helplessly asked, "Then which spiritual academy are you planning to go to? Tell me, when the time comes, I'll go to that one as well." The girl tilted her head and asked, "Why should I tell you? Didn't you say that you'll help block all the arrows behind my back? You can't say something when you didn't mean it. You didn't have this attitude when you first formed a team with me," the boy said furiously. "Number, if I'm with you, it will bother my training. You should just go to your Northern Heavens Spiritual Academy. I won't choose that place." The girl gently let out an sound. She did not wait for the boy to become angry and directly extinguished the fire with a wave of her hand. Then she jumped onto a tree and said, "I'm going to sleep. It's your turn to guard during the night today. Luoli, you didn't keep your promise. Don't act that you're amazing because you're pretty. Tell me clearly." Beneath the tree, an angry voice rang out endlessly from the boy. Above the tree, the girl gently leaned on the tree branch and gently lifted the corner of her mouth under the faint moonlight. At that instant, her charm even made the moonlight dimmer. "Idiot!" She gently smiled within her heart. Then she slowly closed her eyes and fell asleep peacefully. Mu-Chen exhaled heavily. Then he looked towards Mr. Hao in front of him and said with a slight smile, "Mr. Hao, I'll select the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy." "Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy?" Mr. Hao smiled at Mu-Chen, and his eyes showed a meaning as if he understood. He soon nodded his head and said, "That's fine. It's up to you." It seems that Mu-Chen decided to go to the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy because he shared a relationship with Luo Li. However, this was not within the scope of his consideration. With Luo Li's strength and talent, she would definitely be dazzling even if she entered the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy. As for Mu-Chen, he was quite excellent as well. However, he lacked the final part of the spiritual road and temporarily had a bit of a gap compared to the monsters that had successfully completed the spiritual road's trial. However, Mr. Hao knew that this gap would soon be covered by the boy in front of him. He knew that if it wasn't for that sudden turn of events, Mu-Chen's final assessment within the spiritual road would perhaps reach the king class as well. This was enough to prove his talent. "How about the two of you?" Mr. Hao looked at Mo Ling and a West Branch student who haven't decided on their spiritual academy yet. "I'll go to the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy as well." Mo Ling scratched his head and said in an embarrassed way. In his eyes, the 5 great academies were a mysterious and massive existence. Due to the trust he had in Mu-Chen, he felt that it may be better if he was beside Mu-Chen. "I'll go to the Martial Spiritual Academy," the West Branch student also quickly replied. Mr. Hao nodded. This way, the entries from the Northern Spiritual Academy were completely clear now. There would be 2 individuals going to the Northern Heaven Spiritual Academy, 2 for the Azure Sky Spiritual Academy, 2 for the Myriad Phoenix Academy, 1 for the Martial Spiritual Academy, and 1 for the Saint Spiritual Academy. You still have 2 months of preparation time. After 2 months, you will come to the Northern Spiritual Academy once again, and I'll send you to the place prior to the 5 great academies. Over there, you will meet the new students from all over the world. Moreover, there will be a trial waiting for you at that location. If you perform poorly during the trial, there is a danger of being deprived of your entry. Thus, you should train well during these 2 months," Mr. Hao said faintly. Chen Fan and the others suddenly cried out loud when they heard this. The 5 great academies weren't really that easy to enter. Isn't it too harsh with all these tests? When he heard this, Mu-Chen's heart shook. If that's the case, wouldn't he be able to meet Luo Li at that place? "Okay, the entry competition today is over now. For the remaining time, you can manage it by yourself. It is fine even if you take a temporary leave from the Northern Spiritual Academy. However, you must remember to come back after 2 months." Mr. Hao waved his hand and leisurely left. With Mr. Hao's departure, Chen Fan and the others were relieved. Liu Mubai glanced coldly at Mu Chen before heading out directly. Even Chen Fan and the others could feel the rage within Liu Mubai clearly. Cha, he can't even admit that he lost. Chen Fan pouted his lips and said towards the back of Liu Mubai, Mu Chen, it seems that we'll be separated in the future. Ha ha ha. However, I will train hard within the Azure Sky Spiritual Academy. Moreover, I remember that the competitions within the 5 great academies are quite fierce. You must be careful, otherwise I might have surpassed you by the time we meet again. Chen Fan laughed. Mu Chen also smiled. The 5 great academies weren't a tiny place like the Northern Spiritual Academy. It is a place that gathers all sort of talented individuals from all over the world. If they wanted to shine at that location, it wasn't an easy thing to do. Because they managed to obtain an entry, Chen Fan and the others were extremely excited. After they spoke a few words with Mu Chen, they headed off towards their friend. Afterwards, only 2 beautiful girls remained beside Mu Chen as they stared at him. Congratulations. Hong Ling stared complicatedly at Mu Chen. It was evident that Mu Chen was the one in the limelight today. Nobody could have imagined that someone as strong as Liu Mubai would actually be defeated by him. The ordinary boy in her memories back then had become someone bright and dazzling. I'll also have to congratulate Senior Hong Ling. Mu Chen gave a smile to Hong Ling. Then he saw the resentful face of Tang Qianer beside him. He could not help but chuckle. Sister Qianer, this is a happy event. Why do you have such an expression? Are you really that glad that you'll separate from me? Tang Qianer pouted and said. Mu Chen could only helplessly smile. It seems that it was wise to shut up. Are you close with that Luo Li? Tang Qianer said in a bitter tone. Naturally, she saw the different expression Mu Chen had when he said that name. She's a friend that I met within the spiritual road. She's beautiful like Sister Qianer. Mu Chen smiled and said, she completed the spiritual roads trial. Right now, she's probably far stronger than me. Mu Chen sat up fiercely. This was not allowed. If he had fallen behind her too much, it would be too disgraceful. Moreover, she was so beautiful. There must be a variety of excellent individuals who coveted her. Regarding about this matter, he had seen enough of it during the spiritual road. In the spiritual road, he was able to protect her. However, the situation was different right now. Thus, he could not feel satisfied just on this tiny bit of achievement. Mu Chen took a deep breath and began to focus as he suppressed the stress within his body. He entered a cultivation state and began absorbing the spiritual aura within the world as he circulated the great pagoda art. Mu Chen's consciousness entered his body. After a while, he seemed to have suddenly recalled something and allowed his consciousness to enter his aurasia in order to look at a certain location within it. At that location, a mysterious page of black paper was quietly floating. Above the black paper, a mysterious dark purple mandala flower extended out and formed a beautiful cage. In the center of the cage, there was a Nine Netherworld Bird who had restrained the flames on its black wings. Mu Chen's consciousness stared at the Nine Netherworld Bird. He hesitated for a moment before sending extremely gentle thoughts into the cage. Just when Mu Chen's gentle thoughts entered, the Nine Netherworld Bird suddenly opened her eyes fiercely. Fierceness instantly filled its eyes, and it viciously stared at Mu Chen. Boom! It crashed onto the light barrier, formed by the cage, and caused a chain reaction of ripples. Her vicious eyes seemed that it wanted to swallow Mu Chen up completely. Mu Chen was shocked by the vicious aura coming from the Nine Netherworld Bird. However, he could not trap it here forever. It was an unstable bomb. Moreover, it was a bomb that was hidden within his body. If it exploded one day, Mu Chen would probably be blown to the extent where not even his bones would remain. Therefore, he must find a solution to this problem. Regarding the solution, Mu Chen had thought with much deliberation and felt that he should use the method of negotiations. However, only God would know whether or not it would be effective. But no matter what, he must attempt it. That wraps up the content for today's episode. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel to get notifications for the next episode. For now, goodbye, and see you next time.